Another epistle today, and this one is on the old family tradition called the Baumkuchen, or tree cake. Now, everybody in the family knows about it, and but basically it's a cake baked over an open hardwood fire. It's cooked on a wood spit, forms something like a baseball bat that has a handle on it like a rotisserie. And now I believe that everybody in the Grambua or Grambua family has the recipe and has watched the baking at one time or other. Now this cake is usually baked for weddings or wedding anniversaries, but it can be baked for any special occasions, and hundreds of them have. The first one that was baked in this country was back in 1885. It was baked for the wedding of my grandfather Julius Grambua to Teresa Hardy's. Now, Carl Grambua, who was the father of Julius, was a cabinet maker. And when he came to this country from Germany, he brought the formula, or he brought the drawing with him on tree cakes. He didn't have too much that he could bring with him, a few tools, but he did bring quite a few drawings. And he's the man who homesteaded the Grambua property out in Metz, and that's where that clan started. He brought his family with him, and with that family, of course, was Julius and another son and several daughters. Now he made the spit himself, and I understand it is probably made out of maple. Now, Gerald Grambua, the great-grandson, has that very spit. That is, that survived the Metz fire of 1908. Now, the reason it survived the Metz fire of 1908, and that is that the Grambuas had loaned it to the Grambuas, who were just next-door neighbors. Those people knew each other, and they exchanged a lot of information, and they both knew how to make the cake. And now you'll recall that the Grambua home farm did not burn in the Metz fire, and that's of course one of the reasons why that form survived. But it's the same one still used today that has been used for years. Now there are other people who have made that form in that area and who do bake that cake in that area, but they're all somewhat related to the original people. Now, I have observed probably the making of maybe 10 or 12 over the years. A group of relatives of maybe 10 to 12 people necessary to do a good job. And so that we can kind of trade it off. Now, the total baking probably takes about an hour, hour and a half. I'm just judging here. And a couple of people to attend the fire, a couple of people to do the turning, a couple of people to supply the fire and the wood, to keep that going, and a couple of people to act as shields to help control the temperature of the fire. They use shovels or other metal instruments to control the heat. Now, the basic batter consists of 32 eggs, some flour, sugar, and sweet cream and butter. And according to tradition, this stuff is stirred together by a group of people, and there's always a gathering. There's always a big gathering when you bake a tree cake, a gathering of friends and relatives. It's always a big outing. And they keep on, but as I say, this stuff is put together, and by tradition, the batter is always stirred in one direction, and I guess the direction is right. You stir going to the right, going to the right, going to the right. Then the spit, about 24 inches long, has been prepared by covering with wax paper that has been tied down with cotton string, about 1/16 inch in diameter. Then that is lathered with a shortening and then placed on the open fire on a rotisserie-like device that holds it over the coals a distance of anywhere from probably a foot to maybe 15, 20 or inches or more, whatever is necessary. After that form is heated and the shortening starts to sizzle, then a couple of people kneeling before the fire and with great big dishes and spoons start to apply the batter to the spit, which is always turning. And the spit, after it receives the batter, is turned and is allowed to bake on there. And it has to get to a kind of a brown consistency. And then another layer is applied. And this keeps on going and going and going and until all of the batter is used up. Now this takes a good period of time. And of course, in the meantime, the fire tenders and the men who shield the fire, because at certain times you need more heat, sometimes you need less heat, and so it takes takes some doing. It's nice if you could see this thing made in person, because then you would really understand what a labor of love it really is. And as this cake turns, it forms a little bubbles or come out of it, or little branches start to form on it. And this is caused by centrifugal force, of course. That batter kind of moves its way out, and as it lays over the coals, then it bakes as it goes on. And when a tree is completely done, it is a kind of a tree that is has quite a few branches on it, we say. And now after all is done, after it is thoroughly baked, then it is left to cool for a period of time, and then the string is removed from the form and from the bottom side, starting from the big side, and finally that entire cake is freed from the form and then set on edge. And after set on edge, then usually a flower or two is put into it as a token of completion. And when it's all done, it is a beautiful sight to see. And all in all, it's a part of a great family tradition that now extends from 1885 to 1994. Now, the kids in the immediate family, of course, of the Drambergs and the Grambuas, all recall, no doubt, that when their cake was baked for their wedding. And I recall that as a very young person, about 5 or 6, that a group of the Dramberg relatives came by train 2 Mets from Detroit for a special baking. Apparently must have been some wedding going on in Detroit. But I remember that Marie Zimmerman, who was Grandfather Dramberg's sister, came, and she brought one of her daughters, and she also brought 2 of her nieces, who was Augusta and Pauline Floyd. There might have been others too, but they came specifically by train to come up for the baking of that cake. And now the Marie Zimmerman, of course, was a sister-in-law, or a sister to Bertha Voigt. Bertha Voigt had married Ed Voigt. Ed Voigt was the man who owned the Voigt Brewery. And Marie Zimmerman, a sister of Mrs. Voigt, had married a man by the name of Zimmerman, and Zimmerman was the brewmaster at the Voigt Brewery. And I recall another one that I recall later. I know there are other people there that I wanted to mention that I remember of that event. And one of them was Teresa Hardees, who later married Albrecht Kowaleski. And then another one was Louise Hardees, who later married Sam Voigt of Rogers City, no relation to the Voigt in Detroit. And I recall, of course, many other relatives being there. Now, this summer, right now in 1994, there's going to be a baking that's already scheduled for sometime in July for Janet Colosy. Now, that Janet is the daughter of Warren and Nancy King Colosy, and she's going to marry a James Graham in Saginaw. Now, I plan to be at that baking out here in Metz, and there'll be a lot of other relatives there too. Now, I helped turn the cake for the 50th wedding anniversary of Julius and Teresa Dramberg in 1935, and I helped turn my own cake, and to my marriage to Marion Ross in 1942. That wedding was held in Ludington. I also helped turn the cake for our mother and dad's, George and Alma's, 20th wedding anniversary in 1928. And probably, and of course, others too. But most members of the family have attended a good number of these events because it's always a big event. Now, the cake, I might say, this cake is still made in Germany, but is all only made commercially. And people who have gone over there and mentioned the fact that the people in this section of the United States, up here in this northern corner of Presque County, still make it over an open fire. They're hard for them to believe. But nevertheless, that is true. And I know that the cake, the tree cake, was made commercially by a bakery in Chicago. So it has quite a history. So we'll hope to see you. Maybe you'll attend that function this summer also. Now, I might say that the tree cake is a part of real craftsmanship in making, and I know that a couple of years ago, Gerald Grambua and his family, and along with a few other relatives that gathered at the campus of Michigan State College, they put on a demonstration and baked a couple of them down there just as a part of the Michigan Craft Show, and it drew a lot of interest. It's just a unique experience, and I'm happy to say that I enjoyed it very, very much. Well, here we go again. I'll try not to rattle too many papers. I noticed I did that in the last session, but you'll have to forgive me if that's what happens. Now we're going to talk about a little different subject that some of the members of the family have asked me to comment on, and that is my relations with my brother Herman, my older brother Herman. Now, Herman was about 2 years older than I was, and we got along fine. I can truthfully say that in all the years that I knew him, that we never had an argument. I thought about that, and never did I recall that we had an argument that amounted to anything. Well, I suppose we had little scraps when we were younger about who had the baseball or who had the basketball, but other than that, no. We got along very, very well. During the time that I recall that when we were in high school, he, of course, ran around with a little, probably different crowd than I did. They were a little bit older. And I was running around with a crowd that I ran around with all the years that I was in grade school and high school. And he was probably, I was interested in the outdoors and hunting and fishing and trapping or snaring rabbits or building a camp or fishing at Trout River or fishing at Lake Nettie. And Herm was a little bit more sophisticated than that. Not that he didn't like the outdoors, but he just was a little bit a different interest. He was interested in basketball, and he did some swimming. He did some hiking along with his crowd. He was also a member of the Boy Scouts at the same time I was, but again on a little bit different plane. Some of his friends were like Eddie Schultz and Ortford Tush and Cully Hamilton and Frank Ware and a few boys that were a couple of years older than what we were. But it was just a little bit different. Now, Herm was a little bit more, you might say, sophisticated than I was. He liked to dress well. He was very meticulous in his dress. His hat had to be just right, and his tie had to be just right, and his shoes had to be just right. And he always made a good presentation. He even did that as an adult man, as you recall. Always very meticulously. The tie had to be just right. And his haircut had to be just right. And so he always made a very, very good appearance. Now, he was interested more in going to social events, in dancing. And he liked the girls. And there were a lot of social parties that were held in private homes at that time. We didn't have beer gardens where you could go and dance, and so people had them in their homes. We didn't even, for a couple of years there, after the rink burnt and before the new high school was built, there were very few places in town that where you could go to dance, so people held them in their homes. Oh, there were a few dance halls like Greeka's, or the Oddfellows Hall, or the Masonic Hall, and a few places out in the country at the town halls where they had dances regularly, but there was no place particularly in town where young people could gather. And so we got along just fine, and that extended all the way through. Now, Herman started college at the University of Michigan in the fall of 1928. And I remember that because later that fall, that same fall, Dad and Mother and I went down to Ann Arbor, and Herm had secured tickets for the Harvard-Michigan football game in the brand new big oval stadium, which is still there today. And I still have the ticket for that event. And then he stayed at Michigan for about 2 years. And then when I started college at Michigan State in East Lansing, he came over there transferred. Now, I don't remember all the ins and outs of the transfer, but he wasn't quite satisfied at Michigan, and I think that he was thinking in terms of possibly going into some branch of drawing, what you would call landscape drawing. And of course, Michigan State, being an ag school, had a very, very good department in landscape architecture. But of course, we know that later on that he did go back to Michigan. But the year that I went down there with him, in the fall of 1930, we roomed together in a private home at a nice place just off campus from about a block away. And by the way, that home is still there. I checked on it last year. And that is where we started. Now, it just so happens that we were there in the fall of the year, and at the end of the first term, at the end of winter term, the lady of the house informed us that she had sold the house and that we would have to find another place to live because the party that they sold it to was not going to be interested in handling students. Now, I think there were probably about 9 of us who were on the second floor of that building. It was a nice, great, big home with 3 or 4 great big rooms and a bathroom upstairs. And Herm and I had a nice room which had 2 cots in it, and the other 2 rooms had 3 cots in it. And but we had to get out at Christmas time, and it just so happened that just only about half a block away, we were able to get in with a fella who had rented an apartment in what was called the College Inn. And he rented a large place, and it had 2 great big rooms, but he was only using 1. Herm got to know him in some way. His name was Eddie Starr, and so he invited us to come in with him. It didn't bother him. There were 2 great big rooms, and there was a kitchen and a nice bathroom, and so we moved in with him for the rest of that particular year. But basically, Herm and I got along very, very well. On weekends, he would take off and go to dances in and around the Lansing area, and I would probably stay on campus. And now, let me say this, that Herm did have a few jobs, and I know that he worked at the Knapp department store on Saturdays, and then also worked on Sunday afternoons when the store was closed doing certain stock work, I think that they called it. And I had certain jobs when I was in college also. Later on, I would say at the end of that first year, I moved into a fraternity house, Sigma Alpha Epsilon. And while there, for a couple of years, I helped do the kitchen for my board, washing dishes and scrubbing pans and setting tables and doing everything else that you could in a regular kitchen. There was usually a cook and probably about 3 boys that worked in that kitchen assisting the cook for all meals. And so that was, we earned money that way, and I also earned money by working as a gardener in a sorority house, which was just a couple blocks away on Bogue Street. And my job there was primarily to keep the fire going. They wanted, in the wintertime, my job was to make sure that the house was warm and that we had plenty of hot water. I didn't have to bother to shovel any snow because they had made previous arrangements with an elderly man who lived in the neighborhood, and he had been cleaning the sidewalks and working on the lawns for several years. So I didn't have to clean lawns. I didn't have to do anything except just to keep the hot water going. And it paid me about $1 a day, which was darn good money at that time. About $20 a month would go a long, long way. Or I think it was $1 a day. I think they paid me $1 a day. I think it was, well, it amounted to about $30 a month. And that was darn good money. Now, I did have to get up about 6 o'clock in the morning, go over and check the fire, make sure that that was going good. I went over again at noon, and I went over again before supper, and then at night, long about 9:30 or 10 o'clock, I went over again to check the fire to make sure that it would hold overnight. So it was, it kept me busy, but it was darn good. It was darn good money, and it didn't interfere too much with any of my activities. And most of the time, of course, there were periods of time when I didn't have to do much except when the weather got warm. I didn't have to bother with the furnace. I just had to concern myself with a hot water heater, which was a small coal-fired burner which worked very, very efficiently. And my job was to burn all the paper products that came out of the house during the course of the day. And now the garbage and other metal objects and stuff were put into a can, and that was hauled out. I had to haul ashes out, of course, and the ashes were put into cans, and they were put in the alleyway, and then once or twice, or I suppose a week or so, somebody would come along and pick that stuff up. That was also true at the fraternity house. We had coal fire heat, and it was a boiler, but nevertheless we burned coal, but the ashes had to be taken out of there, and that along with other metal, canned, glass objects, which you couldn't burn in the furnace. Paper, of course, you could burn in the furnace. And so Herm and I, at every opportunity, of course, tried to earn some money, because as you can imagine, here is a parent with 6 kids, and 2 of them in college. So it was a real drain, and we knew that it had to be a big drain on the family exchequer to send 2 kids to school. Now, we, of course, did work in the summertime, and I know that Herm worked in the summertime. He worked on the boats. And, he had an arrangement through Joe Valentine, and every summer that he was in school there for a while, he always came home and had 2 or 3 months that he could work on the boats, and he could earn a sizable chunk of money for the next year at school. Now, Herm never did graduate from Michigan State. He returned back to Michigan, and I visited him down there when he was at Michigan, and then he finally ended up by graduating from Wayne State University in business. And that happened after he got back to Detroit. Now, for a couple of years, even after I came back here to teach, Herman was sailing. And he made a considerable amount of money, but his idea was that he wanted to go back and finish college. And he finally did. He got his degree in business from Wayne State, which is now Wayne University. Now, while he was at Michigan, his wife-to-be was also at Michigan, but he didn't know her, Esther Kirby. He didn't meet Esther until he was working in Detroit. And what happened was that before he completed his college, he took a job in Detroit, and he worked for Ford Motor Company at the Milford Proving Grounds. Again, he was going to save more money to go to school. And after handling that job for a while, he found a job with the Pfeiffer Brewing Company in Detroit. A brewery, beer had come back in 1933, and so he got a job in the sales department of Pfeiffer Brewing Company. And that turned out to be the forerunner of a lot of his future success. And Herm's job was in the sales department, and I went with him on a few occasions when he went around to check in the bars, and he would check in the hotels and check in the large restaurants where they sold the Pfeiffer product. He'd go up and talk to the bartender, and he'd leave him a couple tickets to the Tiger games. Now, Pfeiffer at that time had the beer concession at Tiger Stadium. And so, naturally, they were promoting that product every chance that they could get. And Herm's job, and I went with him on a few occasions in the evening, and he'd stop in, this was in the downtown Detroit area, stop in the nice big hotels, go up into the lounge area, where it was usually a combination of a bar and a restaurant, and they sit down, we'd have a beer, have a Pfeiffer's, and then he'd go up and talk to the bartender. And he'd always leave the bartender a few tickets to the Tiger games. That's the way they played that game. And so it was very interesting. And now, even today, right now, I just looked it up, I still have the key to the tap room, my key to the tap room of Pfeiffer Brewery. Now, the tap room was a place where friends of the beer brewery cost. They were all compliments of the brewery. And there were times when I used to go to Detroit, when I was going to school in Ann Arbor, I would go to Detroit, and I'd go to the brewery, and I'd have myself a couple of beers and a nice big sandwich. They had beautiful sandwich meats and beautiful breads, delicatessen breads, you might say, and it was very, very nice. But one of these days, I think I'll give that key maybe to one of Herman's boys. But I still have it today, the key to the tap room. And I used it every time I went to Detroit almost. Because when Herman originally went to Detroit, he lived at the downtown Y. And it was from the downtown Y, of course, that we made these excursions. He was staying there while he worked at Pfeiffer's. Then after he worked at Pfeiffer's for a while, he got to know a lot of the top personnel there, the owners. And became very, very on good terms with those people. And I think that the brewery changed hands. It didn't change name, it just changed hands. And then the question was that some of the personnel would change. Well, Herman sensed that he was probably one of them that would change because they'd want to bring in their own crew. So the owners helped Herm get another job, and he got a job with one Vickers Corporation in Detroit. There was some connection there between the families, and so then he went and worked for Vickers. Now, Vickers made industrial equipment of all kinds and all types of pumps and measuring devices. And one of his jobs there was to recruit professional personnel. He would go to the University of Michigan, go to Michigan State, to the placement departments, and interview people who were college graduates who were looking for jobs. In the case, these would be engineers. And he had the authority to hire them. And I encountered him after I was the superintendent of schools. I encountered him at one time in Ann Arbor at the placement office. I was going down and looking for teachers. And he had already been over to Michigan State, where I just came from. So that's the way our paths crisscrossed back and forth. Now, I was going to say about meeting Esther. He met Esther through another relative of ours. It was one of the boys in the Hardee's family. I think his name was Harold, of Theodore Hardee's son was an attorney, and he worked for a insurance company in Detroit, and Esther was employed there as a secretary. Now, Esther had also graduated from the University of Michigan, and she did secretarial work plus other work that she was qualified to do. And for some particular event that the insurance company was holding, he arranged with Herman. Of course, Herman would see him off and on, that he had a girl there at the office that needed a date. And so Harold fixed up a date for Herman with Esther. And that was the start of that romance, and which, of course, ended in marriage. Now, Esther was a Detroit girl, and I was at her home, at her parents' home in Detroit on several occasions, and also at the parents' cottage, which was on Runyon Lake, which was north of Brighton. A couple of the summers that I was at the University of Michigan going to summer school. But generally speaking, I say Herman and I got along just fine. Now, we didn't have too much contact in later years. Oh, Marion and I went down, stayed with them when they were living on Hartwell. We went down again when they were living in Birmingham. Not Birmingham, but, well, I'll have to think of the name again, but it was where the Ford Motor Company headquarters were, in that area there. And we did keep contact, and every time they came here, they always stopped over, and we had now I never did see their new home in Birmingham, but that was due to a variety of circumstances, and that's got nothing to do with any hard feelings, though, because we did keep in touch by phone and by mail, and so it was just generally good. I can't find I have no recollection of any hard feelings at any time between Herman and myself. Hi, now let's get into a few words here about my wife, Marion Ross. We shared a life for about 50 years together, from August 1st of 1942 to January 27th, 1993. Now, Marion was born in Ludington, Michigan on May 16th, 1911. Her parents were John and Phoebe Ross. She had an older brother, Don, who was about 7 years older. Now, Marion attended the elementary and secondary schools in Ludington and graduated with her class in 1929. Her father had been the general agent of the Pierre Marquette railroad and ferry system. They're operated out of Ludington. The ferries going, of course, across to Wisconsin, to Milwaukee and Manitowoc. And he headed that whole program. Now, and her dad died in about 1923 when she was about 11 or 12 years old. And her brother Don attended Western Michigan University and graduated there in about 1928. And when Marion started college at Eastern Michigan College in Ypsilanti in the fall of '29, Don was through school and he was teaching in St. Clair, Michigan. Now, Marion graduated from college in 1933 and with her bachelor's degree and her life certificate. And she started her teaching career in Marlette, Michigan, teaching in the English speech and dramatics department there. It's interesting to note that her salary, starting salary at that time, was $80 a month. Now, you have to remember that these were the years of the Great Depression, when it was hard to get a job and hard to earn a dollar, and there were millions of people in the country that were unemployed. And this affected the entire society of the nation. I might say that when I started teaching, I started at $110 a month for 9 months, which was $990. Now, in 1933, even the banks closed for a period of time in order to stabilize our monetary system. You could not even cash a check, or if you had one, it was temporarily no good because nobody would cash it. In my own case, I left school in the spring of 1933 because Dad had no money to send and there was no cash. And the cash was the only thing that counted in commerce. Now, in the fall of 1933, Dad scraped up enough money, and the banks partially reopened, and he wanted to send me back to complete my college education, get my degree, and get my teaching certificate. I completed my college at the end of the fall term of 1934. But Dad did not have a job until the fall of 1935, when a job opened in Rogers City, and that developed into 38 straight years in the Rogers City school system. In the fall of 1939, Marion accepted a teaching position here in Rogers City. She taught 11th and 12th grade English and speech and a class in grammar. Now, Marion's specialty was English grammar, using the diagram method, and she was very, very good at it. Many of her former students, especially those who went on to college, often thanked her for giving them a firm foundation in English grammar. Now, I, of course, got into the principalship and also into superintendency, and I consulted her very, very frequently, especially if I had some very, very important letters to write. And also fellow teachers consulted her when it came to matters of grammar. And even in her later years, after she retired, she'd get phone calls from former students wanting to know how to punctuate or how to say certain things to make them grammatically correct. So, although I frequently talked to Marion in the first years that she was here in Rogers City, I did not date her or any other girl at that time, and there were a good number of single girls on the faculty, probably 10 or 12. But I was still all gung-ho on fishing and hunting, and every weekend was taken up with that activity. Marion had her own car, a Plymouth coupe, and she frequently left town on weekends to go home to Ludington or to visit Marlette. And with a good number of single girls, of course, in the community, they frequently got together for weekend activities. And she, of course, I know, had a good number of dates with other single fellows in the community at that time. We had our first date in the fall of 1940. And for me, that first date, that was it. That's all that I wanted. As I recall, I proposed to Marion on the second date. I did not have a ring to give her, for the very simple reason that I didn't have any money to buy one. But she understood that. I gave her her ring on Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1941. Now, we decided to postpone our marriage until we had our debts paid. I had a new four-door Plymouth to pay for, and she had a Plymouth coupe to pay for. But we just did decide that we would go ahead and start to buy some of the furniture that we needed at the time that we would be married. And so that is what we did. We bought furniture ahead, or appliances, stoves, refrigerators, bedroom furniture, and other chairs and tables that we needed for in any home. And we took that material and we stored it upstairs in Mother and Dad's home. And in my bedroom, in the front room upstairs, was a big, big room, and that's where a lot of that stuff was stored. Now, the stove and the refrigerator was stored in the basement. And then there was other material that was stored out in the garage. And so by the time that we got married, we had a very comfortable supply of furniture paid for in our home. And now, we during that time, that of course, that before we got married that year, we made several trips to Ludington and to visit Marion's mother And she had remarried, of course. She had remarried a man named Charlie Clausen, and he was the owner and manager of a small hardware store. It's interesting to note that Marion's high school diploma from Ludington High School in 1929 was signed by Charles Clausen, who was secretary of the Board of Education there. And my diploma, signed in 1930, was signed by G.W. Grambua, who was the secretary of the Board of Education here in Rogers City. Charlie was a wonderful man, and he had 4 daughters. And there are 2 of them that, as far as I know, are still living. Now, at that wedding, that was when we got married on the 1st of August of 1942, at that wedding, my sister Ernestine, Grambua Wilson, was one of the attendants, and there was a girl by the name of Alice O'Neill, a girl that was a good friend of Marion's, who she had taught with at Marlette. And she's still living in Ypsilanti today. Now, Don Ross, who was Marion's brother, was my best man. And he, at that time, was one of the principals in the St. Clair, Michigan school system. Now, Marion and I, when we were married, we moved into a brand new home on Lark Avenue in the Pinewood area of Rogers City. And we were happy that we had furniture that was paid for at the time that we moved in. We lived in that home until 1949, when the house went up for sale, and we weren't interested in buying that particular home. So we had bought a lot over here on 6th Street, where I'm talking from today, and that is where we built the new home in 1949. There were several additions put onto it, of course, since that time, but that's how we got where we are here today. Now, in the intervening time, I had become a high school principal, and in 1944, I succeeded Mr. H.H. Gilpin in the superintendency. Gilpin had been superintendent for 44 years. Now, Marion and I continued to teach in the system. She didn't teach all the years all full through, but we both stayed in the system until 1973, when we both retired. I had a total of 38 years in education as a teacher and principal and superintendent in the Rogers City system. Now, you add that to the 13 years that I spent here in school, and it's a total of 51 years of very, very close association with the Rogers City public school system. Now, Marion and I did some traveling after we retired at 73. We made 2 trips, specifically to Williamsburg, Virginia. She loved the colonial village there, and also 2 trips to Washington, D.C. She liked Washington and all the great things that it had to show for our nation. She was fascinated by the historical significance of both communities. Now, we had planned, one of our big plans was to go to Scotland. Marion was a great Scot. Her ancestry on both sides was Scotland. On the Ross side, both her grandparents came from Scotland, and on her mother's side, her grandfather also came from Scotland. And she was interested, very, very interested, in going back and to see the ancestral Ross Castle, which is in the Highlands of Scotland. It's still there today. And she was well read on the what she called the Clan Ross, and she knew the history of that clan. And but things happened in some of the later years. She started to develop rheumatoid arthritis in her hands and her knees, and it was treated somewhat successfully, but it was a great hindrance, and of course it made travel very, very difficult, especially the walking part of it. And then she also started to develop a kind of a neurological problem, and which was never really identified, but it was a type of a muscular dystrophy family of